This carefully planned attack by the North Vietnamese has been described as their all-or-nothing, go-for-broke effort. It ended in dismal failure. The loss of thousands of men and weapons has taught the communist general a grim lesson.
The smoke of siege and battle over Stalingrad, city of steel. These films were made under fire just before the winter snows marked Russia's great counteroffensive. These are the Russian street fighters that the Nazis could not conquer.
From game-changing strategies to tactical brilliance, these battlefield manoeuvres stand as some of the greatest in military history. I'm James Hanson, and today we're breaking down the genius behind the tactics that shaped wars and changed the course of history. So, buckle up as we dive into the moves, the battles, and the lasting impact of the most legendary operations ever devised. Welcome to our countdown of the top 10 battlefield tactics of all time. First on the list is the flanking manoeuvre, a tactic that's been around since warfare began. The idea? Hit the enemy from the sides. When done right, it surrounds them from multiple angles, cutting off their movement and leaving them vulnerable to a crushing defeat. Now, flanking manoeuvres have played a role in nearly every major battle in history and have been used by iconic military leaders including Julius Caesar, Hannibal, Napoleon and Stonewall Jackson. Now let's break down flanking into three categories: tactical, operational and strategic. Let's start with tactical flankings. They're deployed in individual battles or campaigns. For example, during the Sinai and Palestine campaign of World War I, the German and Ottoman forces were successfully outflanked by the mobile Egyptian Expeditionary Force. Then there's operational flanking, where commanders attempt to wrong foot entire armies, rather than simply a battalion or a brigade. For example, during Operation Desert Storm in the Gulf War, the coalition forces flanked the Iraqis, who dug in along the Kuwaiti-Saudi border and instead swept past them to the west. And finally, there's strategic flanking, when a nation or group of nations surround and attack an enemy from two or more directions. For example, famously the Allies surrounding Nazi Germany during World War II. Next up is penetration of the centre, where elite troops create a breach in the enemy's middle, then reserves exploit the gap. Philip of Macedon used this tactic to great effect in the First Battle of Chaeronea against the Greek alliance. It works as follows. The flanks pin the enemy forces in place and draw enemy reserves. Then, once enemy reserves from the centre are sufficiently denuded, the main assault comes, followed by mobile exploitation reserves, which then wheel and hit the enemy flanks in the rear after rupturing the centre. It's a compact and solid manoeuvre because until the moment of the attack, all your reserves are in the centre and can quickly reinforce either flank if something goes wrong. But the timing of the main attack is crucial. If it's too early, the enemy reserves will have time to reinforce the centre. If it's too late, your own flanks might be overrun. The other downside of this tactic is that it often comes with high casualty rates and requires a numerical advantage to break through. However, when it's executed successfully, penetration of the centre can be devastatingly effective.
By July 9, 1943, the huge task force of almost 3,000 ships and landing barges waited off the southern coast of Sicily and opened fire with their heavy naval guns.
We move on now to the age-old tactic of deception. It's all about creating a fake fog of war through psychological tricks, misinformation, or visual smoke and mirrors. It's a clever blend of disinformation and psychological warfare designed to confuse and mislead the enemy. Now, one of the most successful examples of deception is Britain's Operation Mincemeat during the Second World War. British intelligence managed to fool the Germans about the true target for the Allied invasion of Sicily. They decided to plant a dead body off the coast of Spain, carrying secret documents that purported to reveal that the targets for the forthcoming invasion would be Greece and Sardinia, with Sicily only intended as a feint. Now, to ensure the Germans believed the deception, they needed to create a false identity for the body, which was actually that of a homeless labourer who died after swallowing rat poison. So, they dressed up his corpse as a major in the Royal Marines with the false name of William Martin. Appropriate ID documents were attached to the body, as well as items that added a sense of personality, including a photograph of Major Martin's fiancée, a receipt for an engagement ring, and a stub for a theatre ticket. Then, on the 30th of April 1943, the body was launched into the sea from a British submarine and left adrift just a mile or so from the southern Spanish coast. Once the body was recovered by the Spanish authorities, the documents were passed via Nazi sympathisers to German intelligence officers. Ultimately, the Germans swallowed it, hook, line and sinker. They doubled the number of troops in Sardinia, and when the Allied invasion of Sicily was launched in July, it came as a total surprise to the Nazis.
The invasion of Sicily began at 2:45 on the morning of July 10th. Facing them were 3 German divisions, as well as a number of Italian coastal battalions who had no particular desire to battle the invading Allies.
In just over a month, the island had been successfully captured. Operation Mincemeat was deception done right. OK, coming in at 7th place, we have the art of the feigned retreat, a clever trick where an army pretends to pull back or be beaten, drawing the enemy into a vulnerable position. Let's use a classic example. During the Battle of Hastings in 1066, William the Conqueror's initial uphill attack was foiled by the Anglo-Saxon shield wall formation. But by feigning retreat, he deceived them into breaking their formation and coming off the high ground, allowing his forces to inflict significant casualties on the pursuing English forces. With their ranks thinned out and their shield wall reduced, William ordered his archers to fire on the rear of the Anglo-Saxon army, which succeeded in inflicting further casualties and mortally wounding King Harold, clinching victory for the Normans. Next up, at number 6, it's the counterattack, based on the simple premise that the enemy is weakest when it's just launched an attack of its own. One of the most famous uses of counterattacking was by Napoleon at the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805. While fighting the Austrian and Russian armies, he deliberately tried to lure the Allies into battle by leaving his right flank open and vulnerable. The enemy duly took the bait and fell into Napoleon's trap. The moment they attacked the French right flank, Napoleon filled it. However, on the Allied side, a large gap had been left in the middle of their front lines due to troops being diverted. Noticing the large hole, Napoleon attacked the middle and also had his forces flank around both sides, eventually surrounding the Allies and prompting their surrender. Napoleon had perfected the counterattack. First you draw the enemy into attacking you, then you hit back where they're weakest.
But from the plains of Poland came the first accounts of a new method of warfare, the attack that strikes like lightning, the Nazi Blitzkrieg.
OK, we're into the top 5 now, and next is a military tactic known as Blitzkrieg, meaning lightning war, a fast, surprise-driven strategy that combines speed and firepower for a super-quick victory. Famously used by Nazi Germany in World War II, its origins go back to the 19th century, and it's still used in modern conflicts. Now, the concept of Blitzkrieg was first developed by the Prussians in the early 19th century because they realised that with relatively limited resources, military victories could only come through swift, forceful action. However, it wasn't until the 20th century that Blitzkrieg properly entered the lexicon of warfare. First tested by the Germans during the Spanish Civil War, and then against Poland in 1939, the Nazis' version of Blitzkrieg used a lethal combination of ground forces and air power. The tactic, as employed by the Germans, consisted of a splitting thrust on a narrow front using tanks, dive bombers and mobilised artillery. Wide sweeps by armoured vehicles followed, trapping and immobilising enemy forces. Part of the reason Nazi Blitzkrieg was so effective was at the start of World War II, Germany was the only country that had effectively linked its combined forces with radio communications. In 1940, Blitzkrieg tactics were famously used to capture Belgium, the Netherlands and France, and then later by the Desert Fox himself, Erwin Rommel, during the North Africa campaign. The problem for the Nazis was that, as with any new military tactic, your opponents quickly learn from you. Allied commanders such as General Patton used a form of Blitzkrieg to liberate much of Europe in 1944. And the last great battle of World War II fought using Blitzkrieg tactics was the Battle of Berlin in 1945. But the legacy of Blitzkrieg lives on with variations of the tactic used by Israeli forces during the Six-Day War of 1967, the Yom Kippur War of 1973, and by the Americans during the Gulf War. Fourth on the list is the phalanx. This ancient Greek formation had heavily armed soldiers packed closely together to launch a powerful attack. It was perfect for defending homelands while keeping casualties low. Now, the phalanx works by forming a block of heavily armed infantry standing shoulder to shoulder in files several ranks deep. First developed by the ancient Greeks, a variation of this tactic was still being used in the gunpowder era. The advantage of the phalanx was its cohesion and solidity, and it presented a frightening spectacle to opposing troops. However, the tactic was vulnerable because the phalanx was difficult to manoeuvre, and if it was penetrated, it became little more than a mob. Perhaps the most effective proponent of this tactic was Alexander the Great, who deployed a phalanx 16 rows deep, with his men armed with a deadly type of spear called a sarissa. And for more on Alexander the Great, make sure you check out our video on the top 10 greatest military leaders in history. Now into our top 3 tactics. Let's talk about off-balancing and pinning, a devastating tactic. The goal? Trap the enemy in place, making them easy prey for heavy firepower or surgical strikes. But here's the kicker. With relentless feints and probes, the enemy's so thrown off balance, they have no clue where the real attack will hit. It's confusion and destruction all in one. Let's use another great example, Nelson's famous victory at the Battle of Trafalgar. Napoleon had ordered Vice Admiral Villeneuve to concentrate all French and Spanish naval forces to break the Royal Navy and thus pave the way for the invasion of England. However, Nelson proved adept at off-balancing his opponent. At Trafalgar, Nelson broke with the traditions of naval warfare and thrust 2 columns into the French line to bring a general action where his men's superior seamanship and gunnery would win the day. The French were pinned in place, hence the term off-balancing and pinning, and then thrown into confusion by Nelson's bold and courageous action, producing one of Britain's most stunning naval victories. And if you want to find out more about how Nelson won the Battle of Trafalgar and how the world might have looked now if he hadn't, check out our episode all about it. OK, into the top 2, and in second spot we have the pincer movement, one of the most devastating battlefield tactics in military history. Picture this. Enemy forces charge forward, thinking they've got the upper hand, but suddenly your forces close in from both sides. It's a classic move to trap and crush them, leaving no way out. One of the most famous examples of a pincer movement is Operation Uranus, used by the Soviets during the Battle of Stalingrad in World War II.
The Reds kept the pressure on while waiting for the precise moment to counterattack. It came in October, and the Russian High Command threw fresh troops against their weary enemy.
The Nazis thought they could capture the city in just 10 days, but the fighting quickly descended into brutal street-by-street warfare. Then, on November the 19th, 1942, Soviet General Georgy Zhukov launched Operation Uranus, catching the Germans by surprise. Massive Soviet reinforcements featured 500,000 new men, 900 tanks and nearly 2,000 aircraft. 3 days later, they had successfully encircled the German 6th Army and the remnants of the 4th and 3rd Romanian armies, as well as portions of the German 4th Panzer Army within the city itself. The operation showcased the Soviets' growing ability to match the Germans, and ultimately the Germans surrendered against Adolf Hitler's wishes, who ordered them to fight to the last man and the last bullet. With the Battle of Stalingrad, the tide of the war had turned, and Operation Uranus played a crucial part. It was a pincer movement par excellence. And here we go. Taking our top spot at number 1 is a devastating tactic that combines the elements of surprise and one of the oldest tricks in the book, the ambush. It's been around for millions of years. Early humans used it to hunt woolly mammoths, and it's all about leveraging surprise to overpower the enemy. Fast forward to today, and it's still used to flush out the opponent. To work, soldiers must use first reconnaissance to stalk an area and their enemy, then they take up concealed positions and wait for the signal. Traditionally, engagement begins using long-range weapons such as javelins or bow and arrows. Then, once the enemy is thrown off guard, the ambushing forces leave their cover and charge in using short-range weapons. Over the centuries, ambush tactics have become more advanced. Firstly, there are 2 main types: a hasty ambush, rapidly put together on discovery of the enemy position, and deliberate ambushes, which are painstakingly planned. Then there's the different formations, sometimes linear, sometimes L-shaped. And of course, the weapons used in ambushes have evolved significantly throughout history. The best way to defend against an ambush is to avoid one altogether. But if you are unlucky enough to face one, your best option is to return fire as quickly as possible and to get out of the kill zone. If you take an ambush to mean any surprise attack, then there are many famous historical examples. From the Tet Offensive during the Vietnam War to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. For all the military advancements of recent centuries, sometimes the simplest of tactics is the most effective. And that's why the ambush is our number one. Well, there we have it. That wraps up our list of the top 10 battlefield tactics of all time. As always, if you enjoyed the video, please make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, History Undone with James Hanson, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.